welcome everybody. Welcome to this Mastering Effective Climate Communication webinar presented and hosted by the European Climate Pact. We are very grateful that you have decided to come and spend the next 90 minutes with us, learning about how to develop storytelling techniques to help you present and talk about climate better in the future, right? So before we get started, we have a little bit of housekeeping, so some things for us to be mindful of. This is hopefully going to be a space of learning, so let's keep it respectful and friendly. What we've done for you is we have created a Q&A function for you so that you can interact with us and ask questions. This should be appearing or should have already appeared on the right-hand side of your screen if you are using a tablet or a webinar, and not a webinar, a laptop. You might actually see it on my screen as well. What we'd like you to do is, if you have a question for our experts and for our speakers, please simply type your question in the Q&A area provided. If you really like a question, if you see a question that comes up and you think, oh, that's a really good one, what you can do, I'm just interested. So Andrea, I'm sorry that you say the sound isn't good. As far as I know, the sound should be very good. Just double checking. I think it should be okay. If there's a problem, I will just check. Sound is fine. Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. Okay, wonderful. So let me continue. In terms of the Q&A function, this is for asking questions of our experts and our speakers. Please try not to use this to have a big conversation about something very different, because it takes us off theme a little bit. If you see a question that you really like, please feel free to vote the question up, right? There is a like option, so you can upvote questions that you think are useful. We want this webinar to be as interactive as possible, so please be ready to respond to the live polls and the quizzes. And somebody has already asked about the recording and the materials. Yes, I'm pleased to tell you that you will be getting a copy of all the materials that we use in this webinar, as well as a recording for your personal use, right? So that's where we're going. We apparently we had 2,000 plus people signing up for this webinar. And I'm guessing that this means that not everybody is completely familiar with what the EU Climate Pact is. So I'd like to tell you a bit about it. It's an opportunity for people, communities, and organizations to participate in climate action across Europe, to learn about climate change, to develop and implement solutions, and to connect with other people so that we can maximize the impact of these solutions. As part of the European Green Deal, the Pact aims to become a lively space to share information, to debate and act on the climate crisis, and to offer support for a European climate movement to grow and consolidate. We want to raise the awareness of climate issues and EU actions. We want to encourage climate action and catalyze engagement, and we really want to build a community of individuals and organizations that act on climate and help them learn from each other, right? Those are our objectives within the Climate Pact. As our community grows, the scope of our activities will grow too. So you really want to make sure that you're checking into our website periodically to make sure that you're seeing what's new, right? Our motto is my world, my action, our planet. Hopefully you think that's as inspiring as I do. What we find is that every member state, we have country coordinators and we have PR agencies, and they organize and promote events and activities for the local Pact community and the public. And these include all sorts of things like citizen engagement activities. We have capacity development workshops. We have learn and share sessions. So really there's quite a lot going on. We have Climate Pact ambassadors. These are the leaders of organizations and communities, of informal groups or movements, local authorities. We have representatives from cultural institutions, and we have influencers, amongst others, right? Currently, we have more than 800 Climate Pact ambassadors in the organization. We also have Climate Pact partners. These are organizations who are committed to addressing climate change and contributing to a sustainable future. We have some fantastic tools on the website that you want to tap into. For example, our 6 quick and easy to implement practical approaches that are published on the website. These include things like climate walks and climate games and sustainable potluck meals. We've got peer parliaments, local climate action groups, and more. So again, I've said it before, I will say it again, check out the website. You don't need to reinvent the wheel to get involved in climate communication and climate action, because we've got so many wonderful tools for you to tap into. So that's the EU Climate Pact. The next thing we want to think about is what we're doing today, right? So today we're going to be talking about storytelling as a tool to talk about climate change and to encourage climate action. Specifically, we're going to cover a number of different things. We're going to be thinking about why storytelling works. We're going to be thinking about the elements of a good story. We're going to be thinking about narrative structures, storytelling and emotion. We're going to think about types of climate stories, and we're going to have a tiny taster of how we could use stories in social media. We are also incredibly lucky. We are joined by Isabel Moreno. She is a Spanish Climate Pact ambassador, and she's going to be giving us one of her inspiring stories. Isabel is a physicist, a meteorologist, and a communicator who specializes in climate change. She has presented the weather in different media, and since 2017, she's been doing it in the prestigious program Aquí de Tierra. Please don't criticize my Spanish accent. In English, this means Hear the Earth, and she does that on Spanish public television. She has combined that work with an intense passion for communicating climate change on television, in the radio, newspapers, congresses, companies, courses. You name it, she's done it, right? She is the author of the book Climate Change for Beginners and the co-creator, co-director, and co-presenter of the video podcast Estamos Muy Verdes, which she will talk about later on today. Today, she is one of the most relevant voices in the climate change communication space in Spain. Her opinion is taken into account to elaborate guides. She was recognized as a Spanish top 5 speaker in 2022. She is a LinkedIn topped voice, and she has participated in many campaigns in social media to fight misinformation, among other recognitions. So we're going to hear from her later. We are also incredibly lucky to be hearing from Ecolese, and they are the 2 people who are going to be representing Ecolese are Maria Sanchez, and she's the communication lead, and Nina Klein, and she is the policy lead from Ecolese. Ecolese is a Climate Pact partner, and it is the European network for community-led initiatives on climate change and sustainability. They have over 50 members across more than 20 European countries. The 3 main movements represented are permaculture projects, eco-villages, transition towns, and other networks such as ICLEI Europe, Econ and RIPES, as well as educational and scientific players, for example, universities, are all part of this diverse organization, which advocates for community-led initiatives at the EU level. So we're going to be hearing some inspiring stories and practical on-the-ground storytelling experiences from these 3 wonderful women a bit later. One of the things that I will mention to you right now is that today is not a day that's going to be filled with examples, right? There will be examples, but our objective today is to help you develop some new skills that you can take into the wild and hopefully communicate better using storytelling, right? So that's going to be the focus of what we're looking at today. Very briefly, who am I? This person who's been talking to you for such a long time. My name is Suzanne Whitby. I run a small company called SciComm Success. I help scientists and researchers use stories to talk about complex issues like climate change, but also other scientific issues. I'm a science and climate communicator. I'm a researcher, and I work with storytelling, and particularly experiential storytelling, and I'm an oral storyteller. And I'm going to bring all of this good stuff and hopefully share it with you today so that you can go forth and make change happen. So I'm sure that you're tired of hearing from me, so I would like to hear from you. Before we get started in earnest, I would like to know, use the poll function that you have on the right-hand side of your screen. I would like to know, how comfortable do you currently feel using storytelling to talk about climate change? Okay, I can see we've got some 200 or so responses. Oh, it's going up and up. This is very exciting. It's like being at the horse races. Okay, wonderful. I'll just give you another 5 seconds or so to tell me what you think. All right. Can we close the poll and just see what sort of responses we've had so far? Okay. So, right. So I can see that we've got quite a mix of responses, which is fantastic. Okay. Well, I'm hoping that those of you who don't feel terribly comfortable will feel much more comfortable by the end of this session. So we've been talking about storytelling. I think it's time for you to experience a story, and that's what I'm going to offer you now. This is a traditional tale, and it goes like this. Many, many years ago, there lived a woman, and she was a remarkable woman. She was a woman who was so filled with truth and facts and figures, she was absolutely certain that she needed to take her wisdom to the world. So off she went, out into the cities and the towns and the villages, and everywhere she went, she was naked because she wanted her truth to shine through. The problem was that as she went to the cities and the towns and the villages, people were afraid. They closed their doors. They didn't want to hear her words. They shut their curtains, and nobody heard her truth. And so this woman, whose name was Truth, she left the towns and the villages, and she went and she sat on a stone outside a forest, where one day a woman came past and tapped her on the shoulder. Truth looked up, and there she saw the most extraordinary woman. This woman was not extraordinary because she was beautiful in terms of her facial features or her body. She was extraordinary because of her clothing. She was wearing beautiful colors, rainbow colors, and the most beautiful fabrics that you can imagine. They were gossamer thin, they were silks, they were woolen threads. And she looked down at Truth and she said, "Truth, sister, why are you sitting here? Why are you not out in the towns and the villages and the cities telling your truth?" And what she found was that Truth had decided that she didn't want to get involved in this anymore. She really wasn't interested because nobody would listen. And so, very carefully, Story put her hand out and she took Truth by the hand and she said, "Come with me." And she led her into a house. And in the house, she led her into a bedroom. And in that bedroom, there was a wardrobe. And in that wardrobe, there were clothes and robes of the most beautiful fabrics. There were silks, and there were woolen, and there were cottons, and there were colors. And bit by bit, this beautiful woman dressed Truth in these beautiful clothes. And eventually she took her by the hand and she took Truth to the door and she said, "Now go into the cities and go into the villages and go into those tiny little towns and speak to people, because now you'll find they'll listen to you, because I have clothed you in story." And so Truth did exactly that. She went into the cities and the towns and the villages, and what did she discover? She discovered that everybody wanted to talk to her. Everybody wanted to engage with her, to hear the wisdom that she had to offer. And from that day to this, we find that truth is best heard when it is clothed in story. And so this is a very old story. This is a story that comes from the Jewish tradition. And it's a story that I think we can potentially learn from. So what I'd like to do is I would like to invite you to tell me a little bit about why you think storytelling is such a powerful tool to talk about climate change. So again, a poll is going to pop up, and I would like you to click on the poll. And I would like you to give me a few words about what you think is important, why the story that I've shared with you and other powerful stories have power. Any thoughts? Okay, I can see lots of people are writing. That looks fantastic. That's great. Okay. Wonderful. So I can see we've got quite a lot of stuff in there. Can we close the poll? And I'm just wondering if Chiara or one of the other members of the team might just want to give us a couple of words of what they see, because for some reason I can't actually see your amazing words. I'm not entirely sure what you're saying. Okay. All right. Well, unfortunately, I'm not seeing your words, but I'm hoping that you're going to have come up with some of the things that that I've offered you. And some of the things that I've offered you are this. First of all, really important for us to know that we as humans are wired for story, right? We are, I don't want to say that story is in our DNA. That feels like quite a big claim, but we have been telling stories for millennia. Right? Even before we didn't have language or before we had language, we were telling stories using paintings and drawings. And we were using stories to tell people about our identity, what tribe we belonged to, what group we belonged to. We were telling people about where we found food. We were talking to people about how we could make sense of the world around us. And in order to do that, we started to use structures, right? We started to tell stories in a very similar sort of way. We started to use repetitive patterns in order to tell our stories. And we started to realize that the more often we told our stories, the more likely they would be remembered. And we still do that today. This means that stories are memorable, right? They're things that we just can't forget, particularly when we hear them often and when they're told well. So we find if you ever go home to your family and you're sitting around the table, you might find that your grandparents repeat the same story again and again and again, right? This is how these stories become parts of our family history. Okay. So very, very powerful stories. In addition to the fact that we are familiar with storytelling structures and the repetitive patterns, we know that stories are very accessible because we're so familiar with the structures. This means that it's easy for us to tune into a story, and research actually tells us that stories align us. Right. So what we found is that when somebody is telling a story orally, right, so a spoken story, this could be on television or radio, it could be in a hall. What we find is that the person who is telling the story, their brain lights up in all sorts of interesting places. And moments after their brain starts to light up in all these interesting places, we find that the listeners, their brains start to align, right? They start to light up in the same places. And what we also find with stories is that stories transport us. If you have ever read a book or watched a movie or listened to an audiobook and you've sat on the edge of your seat thinking, what's going to happen next? If you found yourself crying at the end of a movie because you really identify with the character, you know what it's like to be transported into another story. Yeah. It's an incredible opportunity for us because it means that we can pull people with a good story. We can pull people into our story so that they can feel what our characters are feeling. Yeah. So what else do we have? We also have stories being very positive and very important in terms of making us feel something. So I've already mentioned this idea of us following along with characters and crying at the end. This is really important because once we start feeling something, it starts to be tangible. It starts to make more sense to us. And often, comes from research, from a researcher named Paul Zak. He's found that when we trigger oxytocin in the brain through storytelling, we actually find that people are more open to wanting to collaborate, right? More open to working together to solve problems. So this is all very exciting stuff. What we know from research is that stories, or specifically narrative communication, often improves comprehension. It generates more interest and engagement with the topic. It increases self-efficacy through modeling. It influences real-world beliefs, and it can be more successful for persuading an otherwise resistant audience. Lots of big words. What does this mean in plain English? Research tells us that stories activate emotional and cognitive areas in the brain, and this makes them more interesting and more understandable and more believable and more persuasive and more memorable than facts alone. And so if there are any people in the group or in the audience and you're thinking, well, I'm a data scientist, what about the data? It's a good question, right? I work with lots of scientists who are interested in the data and the facts and the figures. What we know is that we need the facts and the figures. Of course, they're the foundation of the solutions that we're coming up with and really important for understanding the problems. Problem is that data alone doesn't actually motivate people to act. If data alone did, then we probably wouldn't be in the situation that we're in now. We would have acted 20 years ago, 50 years ago. What we know is that data informs, really, really important, but stories move people. And we know that if we want to use data in order to move people, we need to clothe data in story. Yeah. So this is just something for you to think about in terms of the power of storytelling. So let's think about the elements of a compelling story, right? Not every story is compelling. So my question to you is this. In your opinion, what elements or components are essential to a good story? This is another poll for you, right? What must a story have to make it a story? And hopefully the poll will open up. Okay. Okay, so I'm seeing lots of lovely stuff here. I'm seeing emotion. I'm seeing a climactic point, relatability, emotions, characters. Wonderful. Okay, we've got experts in the room. I'm very excited. Okay, wonderful. Feel free to carry on writing or typing, and I'll just move on to the next slide in the interest of time. So stories have the following. They've got a good start, a middle, and an end. They have characters. The characters do not have to be human, right? It's useful if they are because we really resonate with human characters. We need to have a situation, right? A status quo, the world as it is. We need to have a conflict or a complication, something that challenges the status quo. We need to have one or more things that happen, right? So this is our action, and we need to have change. If we do not have change, if a story starts and there's some sort of conflict, and at the end of the story, the characters feel exactly the same way, they act the same way, the world is exactly the same, it could be a story, but it's not a very interesting story, right? Not a compelling story, yeah. So there are a couple of different structures that inform the way that we think about storytelling. I'm going to offer you two of them briefly. The first comes from Gustav Freytag from 1900 or so, and he proposed this dramatic arc, which is built on some of the Greek tragedy structures, right? So we've got our beginning, middle, and end. We've got our exposition, world as it is. We've got our inciting incident. Oh no, there's a complication. We've got stuff that happens. We have a climax, right? This is our turning point. And then eventually we move back down to a resolution. We also have something that's called the hero's journey. And you'll notice that I've called this divisive. And the reason I've called it divisive is something that I'll explain in a moment. This is a useful way just of understanding how big stories, so cinematic stories, might work, right? We have a character in their little world, and then somebody, maybe it's a wizard, who knows, somebody comes along and introduces a complication. The character can choose to accept that complication and do something about it, or they can ignore it and do nothing. If they do nothing, there is no story, there's no change. Yeah. If they accept the offer, the invitation, right, they go and stuff happens, right? There is action, there is the rise and the fall, there is love and new friends and betrayal, whatever you want to call it, until they get to the climax. And in our little example here, this is a dragon, right? This little story, the dragon is defeated. That's our turning point. And bit by bit, our characters start to go home, right? They start to return to the end, or to either return home or go to the end of the story. This is a very common thing. If anyone is familiar with Star Wars or The Hobbit, right? This is a very common story that we see in Hollywood. A lot of people who deal with climate don't like this story, don't like the story structure, because they say correctly, climate change is not a dragon. We cannot chop off the head of climate change and everything is fixed, right? The thing is that I think maybe we have lots of little dragons in the kind of communication that you might be doing, right? Maybe your dragon, for example, is a local policy that is just not supporting climate change and climate solutions, right? You could defeat that dragon, metaphorical dragon, right? And you could help to instill a new policy. You might decide that your dragon is your local community is apathetic and full of anxiety. You might then do some climate intervention and defeat the dragon and have a community that is engaged and wanting to act, right? So there are lots of ways that you can use these structures to think about your storytelling and think about your communication, and also to help you structure your stories. The thing is, these are very long and complex, right? So I want to offer you something that's shorter, and I want to offer you something that you can use that is going to be very practical and hands-on. But before we do that, I want you to tell me what you think again. This is another poll type of thing. So please, can you read these two stories or these two texts? And I want you to have a look at them and decide if one of them is a story. And if it is, choose it. And then we'll see who's chosen what as a story. So the first one says, 2 years ago, I moved to Queensland. In that short time, I have seen the natural environment struggling with reduced rainfall and higher than average temperatures. I have witnessed coral bleaching firsthand. The second one says, I live on the south coast where I've always loved nature. I thought the world was perfect until I learned about climate change in year 7, which was a shock. Then the bushfires came, the fires threatened our home. We evacuated multiple times. I felt helpless. I decided to act, to do something to address the problem. Now I organize cleanups, encourage my family to go solar, and urge leaders to do more for the planet. So, what are we seeing so far? Okay, so we're seeing a lot of people who are already saying the second one, B, is the story. Is it true? Is it false? I will tell you in a moment. Before I do, I want to tell you about these two chaps here. This is Trey Parker and Matt Stone. They are the authors of a series called South Park. Some of you may be familiar with it. And they gave a screenwriting course a while ago. And what they said was that when they were writing their scripts, they would look at the script, and wherever something was connected with an and, they would try to cut it out, because and doesn't move the story forward. If I say, for example, there was a boy and he was in love with a girl and he wanted to ask her on a date, and he asked her on a date and she said yes, and they lived happily ever after. Is this a story? This is something that this is something that is really useful to look at and say, this is a whole list of ideas. This is a whole list of things that happened, facts or observations, if you like, but it's not necessarily a story because it's not an interesting story because there's no conflict. If we said, however, once upon a time, there was a dog and the dog loved the cat and the cat was very unhappy about the fact that the dog loved it, and this resulted in a big fight. There was a great big cat fight. Eventually, the dog decided it had to find a new way to deal with this, and therefore it came with a fish, and the cat was very happy, and they fell in love and stayed together forever. Then you've got a story because you've got some of that conflict, right? And the big issue there is really these and, buts, and therefores. And one of the people who spoke about this was a chap named Randy Olson. So he is a scientist who moved on to being a screenwriter, and he took this advice from Matt Stone and Trey Parker, and he said a great story would be one that uses the and, but, therefore format, and I'd like to add to that a resolution, right? So here's what this looks like. This is the situation, and this is the situation. This is our status quo with our characters, right? But there is a problem. Therefore, this is what I'm doing to address it, right? Or therefore, this is what I have done in the past to address this. And what I've then added in the end, if you want to use it, is a resolution, which says something like, what we hope will happen now is, or what is happening now is, or what needs to happen in the future is, right? If we look at those two texts that I offered you earlier on, we can see that we have text A, and I've just added in these and, buts, and therefores. Text A is observations, right? Super, super important. This is a witness statement, something that we need to hear, but it's connected with ands. You know, it's a list of observations, it's a list of experiences with no but, with no therefore, that is very explicit. The second piece, we have an and that helps us define the situation. We have a but, which introduces some sort of complication. We have a therefore, which indicates what the person's going to do as a result of that. And we're then going to be moving on to the resolution, right? So what is that person going to do? This gives us a really nice structure that we could potentially use in putting our work together. So what I think is useful for us to think about here is that all stories are narratives, but not all narratives are stories. A little bit like data, narrative can inform, narrative can give us additional information, right? Narrative can be vital, right? We need to have narrative. We need the witness statements. We need to have the posts on social media where we potentially say something along the lines of, oh, we've got a new team member. Oh, we're going to COP29. Whatever it happens to be, really important, not stories. Okay, if we want to move people, then we need to have something that has this situation, this conflict, and some sort of resolution. Yeah. So I'd like to offer that to you as a starting point. And there are two additional structures that I'm going to offer you that are similar but different. And the reason I offer you three structures here that you could potentially use is because they are going to appeal to different mentalities, like different ways that people think. So I find when I'm working with local activists that this ABT structure is really useful, super simple, right? When I'm working with scientists and researchers, what I find is they want to have more structure. They want to have something that represents some of the writing that they already do. And what we're going to look at here is something called the SCQA. So the SCQA is situation, complication, question, and answer. It is very similar to the ABT, as you'll see. And the reason that it's really useful is that we know it works. It is used very heavily in the consulting world. It was actually developed by an ex-McKinsey consultant. And many of us know, consultants seem to do a great job in persuading people, in encouraging people to act, and of course in winning funding, which could be something that we need to think about as climate activists. So if we're taking that same story that we were looking at, we can see that it's structured slightly differently, right? Same thing, the situation, I live on the South Coast, blah, 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 all good. Then we have our complication, Then the bushfires came, same complication. But what's different here is that we've got a question. We can say, so I asked myself, what could I do to address this problem? And then the answer is the resolution. Very, very similar structure, right? Very similar breakdown to the ABT, but it's got this question. And this can be very useful for us as storytellers. You know, what is the question we're trying to answer with this story? It can really change the way that you're structuring your story. The other structure that you could potentially look at, again, if you're a visual person as opposed to a wordy person, right, you might want to look at something called the story mountain. So the story mountain is a technique or a structure that comes from the creative writing world. And again, really similar, right? Only difference is that we've got this visual of this mountain. So we're setting the scene. This is our status quo, right? This is the world. Who's in it? You know, what are they doing? When was it? Where was it? Then we're thinking about the complication. What challenge or problem or opportunity arises? And then we've got this rising action. So stuff that happens that's going to get us to the climax, that's going to act as a turning point, that's going to allow us to take steps down to our resolution. And again, if we're going to be taking this example that we were looking at earlier on, just to keep with the same example, we can see that this turns into something very similar to both the ABT and the SCQA, right? We've set the scene. We've got our complication, right? But then the bushfires came. And here, these light blue text boxes with the rectangle around it, just to really highlight it for you. You know, this is where the action comes in. If you have a very short story to tell, right, something that you're going to tweet on Twitter or on, I don't know, toot on Mastodon, depending on your choice of social media tool, you might want something really short. If you want something longer, right, then you're going to be thinking about what kind of detail can you put into the rising action, falling action. So again, over to you. I've got a quick question. My question is, which of these structures do you think might be useful for you in creating outlines for your climate stories? Okay, really interesting. So lots of you have said, beg your pardon, lots of you have said the SCQA, right? So everything's going to appeal to slightly different people. So it's really nice to have different tools that you can play with. Thank you for doing that. So the last thing that I'm going to talk to you about in terms of our structure and our tools is how we can potentially make people feel something, right? And what I want to introduce you to is something called a story shape, right? So this is what a story shape could potentially look like. A story shape is going to start with an individual, maybe being in a situation where things aren't too good, right? So they're low on the good fortune, bad fortune axis. And then maybe something comes that makes things a bit better, right? And maybe there is an intervention that makes things go really high up, really good, right? And then everything starts to collapse a bit. But we don't go down to the same level that we were before. Maybe we're a little bit under the good fortune axis. And then there's another turning point that brings us higher up. So this doesn't mean anything so far. What you need to think about is emotion, right? When I talk to people about adding emotion to a climate story, for some people, this is very easy. They are telling a personal story. And when they're telling their personal story, they are emotional, right? It comes through. There is a lot of heart and a lot of emotion, a lot of tears, a lot of frustration comes through in what they're saying. If you are the kind of person who maybe doesn't feel comfortable using very explicit emotion, you can trust in the story shape, right? What we find is that when people, this is particularly relevant if you've got good characters, right? If you have a good character, good complication, got good problem that you're dealing with, that you're introducing, what we're finding is that people can tap in, they're transported into your story, and then they go on this journey. And as things go well, they go up and they feel better. And as things don't go so well, they go down and they don't feel as good. This is emotion, right? You do not need to have big emotional words to inject emotion into your story. There is lots of research into these emotional arcs and the shapes of stories. One of the things that I would offer you is that we don't always have to tell the whole shape, right? We don't always have to tell a story that starts in the valley and goes all the way up and down and up and down, up and down to the peak of the mountain and then back down again. Sometimes we have a little story. We only want to tell a tiny part of the story. Maybe it's the story that starts in the valley and goes up to a gentle hill, and that's where you stop. Another point, you will tell the next piece of the story that takes people to the next challenge, right? There are many, many different small complications, small stories that you can tell within a bigger climate story. So this is how this would potentially show up in your story mountain, right? If this is the thing that you're using. Again, I've shown you that you've got your actions and your emotions in the story middle, for want of a better word. This is where you would have these additional ups and downs if you wanted them. You don't have to use them, but you can use them if you want to. Okay. One thing that I just want to throw out is this idea about being conscious about how we're using emotional arcs and their shapes. Often what we find when I'm talking to climate activists and climate communicators, our stories can be quite depressing, right? It's a depressing subject, let's be very honest. Not for everyone. Some people are very hopeful, but for a lot of people, it can be quite a depressing subject. We start pretty high. We say, oh, life is good. You know, we've got these cars that move us from A to B. We have these planes that allow us to travel. We have electricity on tap, and it's all down to fossil fuel, for example. And then we say to people, oh, but you know, we need to change this because of climate change. And that means that you need to give up the car and you need to give up the plane and you need to be more mindful of how you're using electricity and. Okay, this is just an invented story to give you an illustration, right? So, you know, use your own example if you wish. What happens with a story like this is that we take people downhill, right? It's a downhill arc. It's we're starting quite high and then we're going downhill. And if you can see right at the very end of our arc, we've got a little peak that's coming up. And that's great. But for some people, they might say, well, this positive peak might only come when I'm dead, right? So there's a big distance there between how they're living now and what could the future could potentially be, right? There could potentially be a big gap in terms of their experience, great experience now and perceived negative experience later. Yeah. So I would like to just throw this out there. This is something that comes from the research that I do into storytelling and climate communication, and that is just being mindful about psychological distance, right? So psychological distance could be talking about people and places that are far away from your audience, right? Talking about situations that are far away in the future or, you know, far away in the past, things that aren't necessarily relevant to them. You may think it's relevant, but this is not important to them when it's competing with their day-to-day, picking up the kids from school or caring for a sick parent or being able to earn enough money to put food on the table. So what we have to do is we have to think about making the story relevant to our audience. Otherwise, it's not going to have any impact. Yeah. And with that in mind, as with all communication, before you put your story together, you need to be thinking about 4 things. So who are you trying to reach? Who is the audience? What matters to them? You know, what do they know? What don't they know? What do they want to know, right? Why are you crafting a story? You know, are you crafting a story to persuade them, just to inform them, to entertain them? You know, what do you want them to think or do as a result of your story? Then you need to think about the so what. And the so what is this alignment. How do you bring your objectives in alignment with your audience to encourage them to do or think or whatever the thing that you want them to do? You know, how do you get them to do that? By aligning these 2 things, the audience needs and your objectives. And I always think it's useful to have a 4th item here, which for me is always, you know, if they only remember one thing about your story, what do you want them to remember? Just one thing. If you can make sure that that's the little red thread, right? The tiny thread that weaves its way through your story, then hopefully they'll at least take that home with them, which can be really useful. So again, I'm just going to say over to you. We've got another quick poll. I'm interested in knowing if we're going to be thinking about climate stories or climate actions that you need to talk about, what sort of distance might you need to consider in your stories? So do you sometimes find yourself talking about time, too far in the past or the distant, the past or the present, beg your pardon, past or the future? Do you find yourself talking to people, for example, in your hometown, about people who live far away with whom they don't seem to have any connection? Are you talking about polar bears when they've never seen a polar bear? Are you talking about experiential, this idea about people who are not experiencing climate change, trying to get them to connect with something that is very visceral for people who are experiencing floods or droughts or extreme weather conditions? Okay. And I can see social. Yeah. So lots of people say that we need to be more mindful about these social things, right? These ideas about the other, the community themselves. Super. That's wonderful. Okay. So I'm going to stop there for a moment and just see if we can deal with some of the questions that we have. All being well, I will hopefully be able to see them. Give me 2 seconds. I'm going to stop sharing whilst I do this. Maybe, she says. What questions do we have? Right. So looking at what we've got in the list, so about misinformation stories that cause negative emotions and also trigger people to act in hate speech. How to counter these? So I guess this might be talking about stories that other people are telling that seem to set us or encourage individuals to act in the wrong way or act in ways that are counter to good, positive climate action. I mean, this is quite difficult. I think, ultimately, this is a storytelling is something that is a very powerful tool for anybody who is telling stories. Anybody who's communicating. And so, of course, people who are spreading misinformation are often excellent at doing this. I would say that repetition helps. Telling the same story, your climate story with your climate messaging, again, and in different ways. Because as we've seen with the little tools that I've offered you, different people respond to different kinds of stories, right? We find, for example, that some people respond very well to video. We know, for example, the younger generation, Gen Z and younger, they love videos. This is how they get their information. This is why TikTok is such a popular tool. So making videos to try and reach that audience, spending more time on Facebook, using that as a tool could be a way to tell your stories. Making sure that you're doing more face-to-face storytelling with people around dinner tables with different generations. Always the same message. Repetition has a lot going for it. Somebody said, are there any things that should be done differently when we're telling stories to adults and children? I find that it's really interesting, actually. So I tell stories to both children and adults. I work with both groups, and I sometimes find that children are much more open to stories that tell you about these terrible things that happen around the world, and they get much more inspired to act. Whereas I find that often adults tend to be a little bit more, but I can't do that, but there's something else going on, but there's something more important, right? And so when I'm talking to children, I try to inspire them. I say to them, what can we do? When it comes to adults, I think a lot of this is also about preempting their objections. So you tell the story and then you say something along the lines of, I know that you've got a lot going on. You've got to work, you've got kids, you've got caring responsibilities, you've got life, whatever it happens to be. Everyone's got something, right? So what could you do, right? What small thing could you do? Don't set the barriers too high, I think, with adults. That's what I tend to find. And somebody said we've provided examples of stories and structures that are rooted in the Western tradition. What about other storytelling? I have specifically chosen to talk about the Western tradition for now, because we're talking about storytelling in the European context, right? We're looking at the European Climate Pact. But yes, there are, of course, many other different kinds of storytelling. And yes, they would be very relevant to discuss. It is also why I introduced the story with, with a traditional Jewish tale rather than a story that is set heavily in the European context. And I think if we did this, then we would need another 2 hours to talk about it. It's impossible to cover all of this information in a 90-minute session. Okay, so we're going to see if we can take 2 more questions just to finish this off. And then I'm going to introduce you to our lovely speakers. How do you get the reaction from getting politically charged? To be honest with you, sometimes this climate change is a political subject. It's something that is divisive, and sometimes you can't. Again, you can preempt. You can say, I know that you have already been doing X, Y, Z activity to try and deal with this problem, and I respect that. And I think we can do more, right? You can humanize the story, but to prevent it completely, I don't know. I think that, political subjects are political. And what else do we have? Creating a good story takes time. This will be the last one. Do you have experience in using AI to help create stories from your research or communication materials? So I don't use AI in my stories, or not yet. I use, as I said, a lot of traditional stories. I use a lot of future stories. So what I do is I look at a lot of trends, to see what research is telling us from the past. We look at what's happening in the popular media, right? What people are talking about, what could be the next big thing on the horizon, and then try to bring those into a full story. I spend a lot of time crafting those myself, and then I would potentially use AI and say, hey, AI, what do you think about this? Can you give me some feedback about, have I missed anything? But I haven't actually had any experience in creating completely new stories using AI entirely. I have this feeling that AI is great, but having the human touch at the beginning is a good place to start. Okay. Right. So with that, I think we're going to move on just in the interest of time, because we've got 2 wonderful talks to hear. And I'm just wondering, so we're just going to move on. Sorry, I just have to stop this for a second and move on to presentation. So we're going to start off by hearing from the lovely Isabel Moreno. And she is going to be talking to us about a personal story. Was it a personal story? Could be a community story. Isabel, you're going to have to tell us, my lovely. And I will share my screen. And Isabel, it's over to you whilst I'm sharing my screen.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. It was an amazing presentation, Susan. Thanks a lot. Okay, so meanwhile we are waiting for the presentation to start. Okay, we're going to see first of all a briefing about me. As Susan has told before, I do a lot of things. I work on TV. I don't know if it's in the next slide. Can we move to the next slide?
Mm-hmm. It should be going. Hang on. There we go. No.
Can we?
There we go.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I do a lot of things. I work on TV, social media, a lot of things. But today I'm going to talk about what I call my little baby, that is Estamos Muy Verdes. And Estamos Muy Verdes in Spanish, in English, literally, is like we are very green. So it has a double sense in Spanish, because you can understand this, we are very green in an ecological way. I mean, in terms of ecological things, we do a lot of things for fighting climate crisis and so on. But in Spanish, to be very green is also not to know much about one thing. So it's like a funny name to use in this area. Sorry, because I have a window here. Okay, now I don't have it. Sorry. So this is Estamos Muy Verdes. As I've been working in this area a lot of years. I know that the thing that is the most powerful thing to move people is to see other people doing things. So that's what we wanted to do in this video podcast in Estamos Muy Verdes. I'm the co-creator, co-director, and co-presenter of Estamos Muy Verdes, and the other co-presenter is Irene Baños. There is a journalist that we can see here, and also we work with Good for Good, is part of CAT Spain. And in Estamos Muy Verdes, our theme is that a very mature podcast, another play with green and so on, no? A very mature podcast that shows actions to mitigate and adapt to climate crisis with a touch of optimism, hope, and eco-friendly humor. As I have told you some seconds ago, this is a video podcast that you can find in digital platforms and also for free, because we thought that you can, if you want to inspire people, you have to be really accessible for them. And also there was not any video podcast with this quality of image and video in Spain. So it's like we are very different in this sense. Nowadays, we only have one season with 9 episodes, and as you see, they're not very long. They are like 30 minutes each one. And also, we have created a seal of identity that is very important. We have tomatoes, as you can see here, and we play with these tomatoes. These ones you see green tomatoes, but on the other side we have red tomatoes. Okay, if we move to the next slide, we have also a part of the video podcast that is a sale of identity. That is what we call tomatódromo. I don't know how to say this in English. It's also, we have invented this name with tomato and so on. And it's a part that we go to the street and we ask people what they think about one topic that we are going to talk about in the episode. So as we are here today with you, let's do a tomatódromo, with all the people that are here. And we are going to ask you 2 questions. The first one. Next slide, please.
Mhm.
If I tell you that a person generated a genuine revolution in his or her neighborhood, how would you imagine that person look like? First of all, is that person a man or a woman? Just 5 seconds, because it's a very easy question, no? Man, woman. Okay, can we stop the question, please? How can I say? I can't see the answers. Can someone tell me the answer, please?
You have to answer for yourself.
Half, more or less. Okay, so let's move to the other question
Okay.
about the age of this person. Do you think okay? Oh. This is going to be a surprise. I love it. Okay, so we are going to stop these questions
Mhm.
and we're going to move to the next slide because I want to introduce you to Manuela. This is a real story. This is the number 5 episode of Estamos Muy Verdes, in which we interviewed Manuela, that is a old woman that generated an incredible revolution in her neighborhood. As you see, Manuela is a normative person. It's like, okay, it can be your grandma, it can be your mother, it can be your neighbor. It's a very normative person. So let's move to the next slide to see what happened to Manuela. Manuela lives, because she's still living here nowadays, in a neighborhood that is called Poblado Dirigido de Orcasitas, that is in the south of Madrid. This is a neighborhood that has like 23,000 citizens, more or less. And what happened to her? One day in her building, one rock fell down. We're going to move to the next slide because we're going to see how her building was some years ago. We're going to see that building, and we're going to see that under the windows there were like big rocks. In the next slide, please. Yeah, here we have. There were like, as you see, very big rocks. Sorry if there is any architecture here, because I don't know the name of these kind of stones or rocks. But however, these rocks are really, really heavy. They weigh like 1 ton. So it was a really dangerous situation. So they decided to go to the council and ask about subsidies to restore this rock. And they told them, no, back. Well, it doesn't matter. Let's stay here. Well, now you know the end of the story, no? They told them that yeah, they could restore the building, but soon they were going to be other subsidies to enhance the energy efficient of the buildings. So they decided to ask for these other subsidies to make the building more efficient. It wasn't easy because they had to ask for a subsidy of more or less €500,000. Imagine that meeting with your neighbors and telling your neighbors that you have to spend €500,000 to restore your building. But however, some time ago, some time after, you were going to have all that money back. But at first, it's a really difficult situation. But they decided to do it, and then the building changed a lot, as you can see. And they were really happy with that restoration. So Manuela decided to ask other neighbors to join this restoration. She started to organize meetings with other neighbors to tell how good was that kind of subsidies. In the first meeting, only 6 neighbors went to that place. So it was terrible. The second one, around 8, 10, and little by little, more and more neighbors started to go. But there were also a lot of conflicts because they didn't trust her. Imagine that you are going to tell your neighbors that you can't opt to one subsidy to make your building more efficient, and you have to spend €500,000 for doing it. Yeah, you're going to get that money back again, but at first you have to sign that you're going to spend that money. So a lot of people told her, no, you are going to take that money for you. So she had a lot of conflicts, but at the end, she has changed all the neighbor. Little by little, step by step, more and more neighbors started to change their buildings, and now the neighborhood looks like this. If we move to the next slide, this is a comparison between how buildings are now and how buildings look like some years ago. A lot of buildings have energy and economical savings. They used to spend more than €200 in heating during winter, and now they spend like 60 euros per winter. That's a great difference. Also, they emit much less gases to the atmosphere because of this. Soon there will be like 100 buildings restored and more than 3,000 families that are benefited with this kind of restoration. Okay, so although she didn't have the recognition of the neighborhood some years ago, right now she has a lot of recognition. If we move to the next slide, we're going to see that not only social media and media in general in Spain thought that what she was doing was a great idea and was amazing for the neighborhood, but also the European Commission went to that neighborhood to meet her and to know what she had done to that neighborhood. And also, she had another recognition because some weeks ago, we won the first prize because of this episode in the Sustainability Journalist and Communication Awards of Masorant. So we are really grateful for Manuela because she's really inspiring, not only for us, but for all the neighbors in that place. And just to conclude with, we move to the last slide. As I have told you, this is a very powerful story because Manuela is a really normative woman. Everyone can be Manuela. This story is a real story and can be replicated in other cities here in Spain, of course, but also in other countries, because this neighborhood, El Barrio Dirigido de Orcasitas, can also be any neighborhood around the world. And also, this story is very inspiring because it has a happy ending. So thanks, Manuela, because I'm sure that you are going to inspire not only Madrid citizens or Spanish citizens, but only people around the world. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That's amazing. Absolutely incredible. What we're going to do is we are going to move on and we're going to hear some more stories or some more information about stories from the lovely ladies from Ecolise. We have Maria Sanchez and we've got Nina Klein. Nina and Maria, can you get us started?
Yeah, thank you very much, Isabel, for this great story, and also to Suzanne. So I'm Nina from Ecolise, which Suzanne introduced a bit. It's the European network of community-led initiatives on climate change and sustainability. So probably you know one of these community-led initiatives, and Maria, my colleague, Maria Sanchez, will talk about the stories which we harvested from these community-led initiatives in a bit. So they're self-organized communities. Do you know maybe eco-villages, permaculture, transition network? It would be interesting in the poll if people could say, yes, I do, or no, I don't. So basically, it's community-led initiatives who do something on the ground. It's grassroots action on climate and sustainability. And Ecolise is there with the goal of representing this group of communities and people on a European level. So the special thing about Ecolise is really connecting these grassroots levels of action, a world that is there already of hope, of action, of inspiration, with the EU levels of policy. Do we have an outcome of how many people do know these community-led initiatives? Whilst we wait, I'd like to go to the next slide.
Mm-hmm.
So what we've based the communication campaign by Ecolise on is a manifesto, which is called Time for Collective Action Manifesto. Because what these community-led initiatives have in common is that they do something already. So it's positive, constructive hope, because the world that we need to change is changing hearts and minds, our own hearts and minds. So the conviction is that we need a change of hearts and minds, a change of values and beliefs and worldviews, because that's what brought the planetary crisis to the planet and humankind. This Time for Collective Action Manifesto is out there. So we invite you also to read it and sign it, because the mushrooming effect, the more people, the better, works for this campaign as well. We've worked on this manifesto with a group of 900 people for 2 years. So you can see that there was a long alignment process. And Suzanne, you talked about this need for alignment in stories. And the idea, and that's going to be in the next slide
Mhm.
of the communication campaign, is really to have a participatory approach to the campaign. And participatory because the communities, the agents of change, which are represented within the Ecolese networks and partners, basically they believe in direct democracy or in participatory democracy. So also the campaign was to be as participatory as possible. Why storytelling? Suzanne and Isabel said that already. Changing hearts and minds of people works with stories, works with emotion, works with seeing somebody that you can identify with doing stuff which you think is possible and which you'd like to do as well. So we based this campaign on the core messages of the manifesto. And one core message was support community-led initiatives as laboratories for transformative social innovation. And you already see, whoops, that's quite complicated language. So this is the manifesto language, which is targeting EU-level policies, the European Green Deal. So what framework conditions do people who want to act for climate need so they can act? And the Ecolese networks are seen as people who can trigger transformative social innovation. So what that means is they do different things, but they also do these things differently. And this doing things differently is what they bring, it's social innovation. And the core message too, and my colleague Maria will talk about that in the next slide, is support the right to have a choice to live sustainably. So also this is a policy ask in the manifesto, and we ask our over 70 campaign partners to work with us on these core messages and to empower each partner to speak in their own voice, aligned on the messages of the manifesto. I think with this, I'll hand over with the next slide to my colleague Maria, who is communications lead at Ecolese. So it's important to say it was a collaboration between policy and communication. Over to you, Maria.
Thank you, Nina. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Susan, for the introduction. I think it was a very interesting presentation, and we had this thought. I mean, I think all of us, we have a storyteller in ourselves, that we all have a story to tell. We all have a vision of the world that's unique. We all have a unique storyteller in ourselves. We've seen plenty of movies. We've read lots of books. We've, we tell stories to one another every day. And naturally, we know how to tell a story. But sometimes when we ask people to write their own story, they get a bit paralyzed. So I think these workshops are very helpful for everyone, to guide a little bit. But I think that something that's very important is to really connect with our own stories and try to think about how we would tell the story to our friends, to our family, to whoever we are comfortable speaking with, and then maybe come back to all these, like all these tips and advice that we are providing. There's tons of literature written about how to write a story, and these are kind of like the basic tools. And of course, there's natural people that have a natural talent telling their stories, but I really think everyone has this ability. We do tell stories every day, basically, and I think we need to also share this to let everyone know that it's easy, that we all can do that, and that these are just tools that we try to put together for you to make it, to don't get scared about it. So we actually created a storytelling workshop as part of the advocacy campaign Nina was sharing before. And we did that with Freya Barnes and Andrew Brightwell from Project Story. And the idea was to, again, provide the tools to campaign partners to tell their own stories, because we thought that was the best way we had to connect with policymakers in a way that goes that was a bit more meaningful. So from that storytelling workshop, we created a toolkit, these stories of collective action, which is available on the Communities for Future website. It's communitiesforfuture.org if you would like to have a look. Perhaps you can go, Suzanne, to the next slide now. And again, we also used the Story Mountain in the workshop to also allow campaign partners to tell their own stories, but also there was inside of the toolkit, there is, because it is still available, and I also would like to encourage people to go write their own story of collective action. We also tried to link the core messages of the manifesto that Nina was talking about before, and to allow to help them see how they could fit these messages in this mountain. So, for instance, starting with explaining why their community-led initiative is a laboratory for transformative social innovation. That was a way to explain who we are, no, or what we are doing, or where. Then later on the impact and the problem. After the impact and the problem, which I think everyone agrees it is a needed part of a story, an element of a story, no? This conflict, this problem, this issue, this challenge. We also wanted them to talk about the right to have a choice to live sustainably, no? And this was part of the solution that each community-led initiative was bringing to the situation. And finally, on the resolution, because we started this campaign also at the context of the EU elections, we were also trying to convey the third message of the manifesto, which was the importance of harnessing the power of community-led initiatives and the power of community in general for a strong and localized European Green Deal, which was, we were trying to make it part of the resolution. Susan, you can move to the next slide, please. So we've received stories from Portugal, from Spain, from Hungary, from Belgium, and from other countries, and we are supporting some of them with videos, because, you know, I think also there are many ways to tell a story, and perhaps you need to also think about what's your best talent to tell a story, no? So it could be in a photo can tell a story itself. It can be a video, it can be a written story, it can be a song, it can be a painting, you know. So I think that if all of us can connect to that creativity in us that really shares and connects and brings emotion to the data, to the statistics, I think that we live in a moment that there is such a saturation of information, of data, that we need to go a bit deeper and try to connect in a more meaningful way. Thanks, Susan.
Super, thank you so much, and so interesting. And you know, we've now got some examples of storytelling in action and storytelling toolkits, and of course, beautifully, some examples of storytelling in social media too. So thank you so much, my lovely. We've actually got a couple of questions for Isabel and for Maria and Nina. Equally, ladies, can I start with you first? Is that possible? Somebody's asked, do you think it would be smarter to team up and create one widely shared climate story, or are 1,000 tiny stories equally smart? Nina and Maria, a nice, easy question for you. What do you think?
Well, I can go. I think that the diversity of stories is it, because it's really the diversity of our stories is like biodiversity in ecosystems. So that creates the resilience. That's one thing. And also there is no one story. So I like the multifaceted approach.
Wonderful.
Maria, what about you?
I mean, we are the network of community-led initiatives. So I think, again, that you know, there's a power also in this diversity, in all of these stories. That there is no way there's one single story that can tell the whole truth. It's just like a variety of them that makes things are not, you know, like things are not black and white. There is a scale of grace, and that is what makes it rich, I think.
Okay. Wouldn't it be easier if we just had to tell one big climate story? Thank you for your input. My lovely Isabel, so we've got a long question for you here. Somebody's asked, a lot of us are communication specialists working for corps or NGOs, not journalists. How are we supposed to find and promote stories like Manuela's and do all of our other work? Also an easy question for you.
An easy question for me. Yeah. Well, I'm going to ask with my experience and how I met Manuela, for example. I met Manuela in a congress in my neighborhood. I live in a neighborhood in Madrid that is called Vallecas. It's a very famous neighborhood in Madrid. And we were talking about different actions to fight climate change. And a lot of people started to say, no, this is like Manuela's did. No, this is very similar to what Manuela's did in her neighborhood and so on. So I didn't know who was Manuela. So as everybody knew Manuela, I asked for her, and then I met Manuela. And also it was difficult for me to elaborate the first season and to identify this kind of actions. It's like you start to hear from people and so on, but do you know what happened? Once the first season was released, some people started to write to us telling, look, this is what I do. This is my action. Do you find interesting to show this action in your video podcast and so on? So I think that the start is like very difficult, but then there are a lot of people that know. There are a lot of people that know other people that does similar things, and then they start to move to make their action more like to show their actions. I don't know if I'm explaining well. I think that I'm not, but the first step is find some actions, and then if you start to show them, other actions are going to move to that place, are going to be asked to be shown, I mean.
Perfect. Okay. I mean, this, in fairness to whoever asked this question, this is a hard question. And I think that everybody who works in climate communication, sustainability communication, you know, I think we all struggle with this, you know, the work of doing our ordinary day-to-day job, plus finding and promoting stories is always a question of balance. And I'm not sure that there is a golden solution to offer you. I guess it's not very helpful, but I would say do your best and look after yourself, because if you're not around, then no one's going to hear any stories, right? So wonderful. Isabella and my lovely Maria and my lovely Nina, thank you so much for your contributions. I'm mindful of the time, so I'm just going to move us ahead a little bit. I'll show you what we've got to. Here we are now. We've got through almost everything, and we were going to have a sort of a 10-minute conversation about using stories in social media. And I think we're not going to get to this in any great depth. I'll show you a couple of quick things that might be interesting, just to spark or to whet your appetite is the word I'm going to use. you know, we found there are many things on social media. We use this term all the time, this idea of storytelling. There is Instagram stories, and there are TikTok stories, and there are YouTube stories. But hopefully I've already pointed out that many of the things that we're talking about aren't stories. So this really powerful fact, is it a story? Maybe not. Even when we read the text that accompanies this, it's not really a story. It's a call to action, but there isn't the story that's helping move us ahead. Yeah. An alternative to this might be something that I found over here. You know, this is also, I think it was from, I think it might have been on LinkedIn. Don't quote me, I can't remember now. But this is somebody who's written something very short. You know, those of you who are on LinkedIn, there seems to be a bit of a trend for having 1,000 word posts, which personally I can never read. I don't have the time. This person over here, Amy Westerfeld, she had a very short, 5 lines of text that is very digestible. And when you look at it through the lens of this kind of ABT structure, you can see that she actually told a really short story. You know, so she's spoken about months ago. Someone asked me if there was a list about the hashtag Project 2025 orgs, but oh no, there's a complication. There wasn't. Very easy complication. Therefore, I made one. Here it is, right? This is not a big world-changing story. Tiny little story on social media that contributes to climate communication. Not all of our stories on social media need to be big and complicated and sexy, right? And they don't always have to be one thing. So often, I think this is from Instagram now, but this particular story here was all encompassed in an image or two. I think there are 3 images in total, and some text on the right-hand side. And the text on the right-hand side is our and, but, therefore, with a call to action, right? But then you've got other people who take completely different approaches. They spread their amazing story over, 8 different slides. Which is what this person has done, or 8 different images. So there are many ways for you to play with stories. They can be long and complex, they can be short and to the point. And if you use one of these structures, I think you'll be in really good hands. So what I'm going to do, we have quite a few questions still on the list, which realistically we're not going to get to. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to summarize where we've got to, and get through the last a few bits and pieces that might be useful to you. And if anybody needs to stay on, or anybody wants to get in touch later, I'm very happy to have a conversation if that's useful. So main takeaways that we want to bear in mind. Bearing in mind again that we've got this very big, diverse crowd, right? So you want to remember that stories are powerful tools in our climate communication toolkit. They're more interesting, more understandable, more believable, more persuasive, more memorable, and facts on their own. I've offered you a couple of different structures to play with. I also mentioned the hero's journey. Other people have mentioned in the comments things like the Virgin's Promise. There were a couple of different structures that were mentioned. These are not the only structures out there, right? There are more structures out there that you can use. For a story to be effective, at a very minimum, it needs to have context, complication, and change. Right? If you don't have change, it's not going to be a good story. If you don't have complication, hard to get the emotion going. And if you don't have context, you don't really have a starting point. There are many narrative structures that we can use. As I said, I've offered you a few, but there are many others out there, many that are coming from different traditions. Emotion in story really adds to their effectiveness. Emotion makes stories sticky. It makes stories viral, right? And it really encourages us to act. And research shows that the right kind of emotion can actually make us want to collaborate, which is a fantastic thing. There isn't just one flavor of climate stories, right? We've seen from the work that Nina and Maria and Isabel have spoken to us about. There are individual stories, there are collective stories, there are imagination stories. There are so many ways that we can tell stories. And although it would be wonderful to have one big climate story, maybe thousands of tiny stories would be better. And just because social media says it's a story doesn't mean that it is. Stories have a different structure to ordinary content, but of course, lots of content has value, not just stories. So that's something that that I think might be useful for you to take home with you. You also want to be aware of the amazing Climate Pact activities that are coming up. So some of you agreed when you signed up for this workshop to receive further communication about the EU Climate Action Academy. You are automatically, as far as I understand, you've automatically been added to the next webinar, which is on the 10th of December at 12:30 again, CET. If you would like to be part of that program, and I think you will want to be part of that program, because it's not just about climate communication, it's about how to navigate difficult climate conversations. Many of you have mentioned that today, and it's about social media, right? So also interesting for you. Please visit the Climate Pact website, make sure that you've signed up, and if you can't attend that, attend something else, right? There's so much going on, and it's all worthwhile and all relevant. And of course, we are very grateful that you showed up today. And thank you for your time. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for your insights. Please take a few moments to make a note of our social media. Join us, participate in the conversation, learn from us, use our tools, and go forth and make great change happen. And for those of you who've been asking, can I get a copy of the slides? Yes, you will. Can I get a recording? Yes, you'll receive the recording, and you're going to receive some extra resources that are going to be really helpful to you, hopefully immediately and in the future. And on that note, at 2:01 CET, I wish you all a wonderful day wherever you are in the world, and good luck with your climate communication. Thank you. Goodbye.